think I can be as entertaining as the cartoon that many of you have been seeing around campus for the last few days, but I'll do my best. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Dr. Galeo and the university for bringing me here. I'm here, I guess, for a couple of reasons. I was very pleased to guest edit a recent issue of the American Book Review, which is published here at the university with a focus section on comics. I'm actually quite proud of the material that we have in here. I was able to get a number of fantastic writers other than myself to write about some great comics. To write about some great comics that don't always get the kind of attention that they deserve, despite being quite sophisticated and nuanced, which I thought was very much in keeping in the mission of the American Book Review. We're very fortunate to have that as a presence here on campus, of course. And the other big, the variety of things I've done over the years, I think probably the big qualification for doing something like that is my work as series editor for Best American Comics. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what this book is. My understanding about this reading series is that quite often you have people who themselves are writing books or poetry, fiction or nonfiction, who have, who can come and maybe talk about their work, but also read to you about their work. What I do has a lot more to do with being a kind of editor and critic and scholar. And the work that I'm doing right now with Best American Comics has more to do with putting other people's work together in a way, as a way of making a statement, a kind of almost like an editorial or collagist impulse. But to me, in a way, that's also very close to what comics do, which has to do with putting pictures and words and pictures and different fragments and pieces together to make a statement, but on a more macroscopic level. So I just wanted to explain what this book is. Best American Comics 2014 has been out for almost a year. Best American Comics 2015 is going to be available on October 6th. I actually just got an advance copy here. Guest edited by Jonathan Lethem, the novelist, with a cover by Raymond Pettibone, who some of you may know. He's a fine artist. He's also done artwork for bands, including Black Flag and Sonic Youth, things like that. But anyway, what this is, it's one series in a kind of overall umbrella series published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, these Best American titles. Maybe you've seen them in bookstores. The most long-lived one at this point is Best American Short Stories, which this 2015 is celebrating its 100th anniversary. So for 100 years, there's been an annual book with an editor attached to it that seeks out short stories from across the literary spectrum, attempts to identify the best ones, and then republishes them in an annual volume. So what this is it's kind of, it's a project that has an interesting position because it's publishing as criticism. It's putting material together to make a critical statement, and of course it's very provocative to put the word best on anything. Of course, no one will ever be happy with it. But regardless, I think it is an important thing to make these annual critical statements. And Best American Short Stories has been successful and prestigious enough that it's spawned many others. As you see here, there's about a dozen titles in this series or meta-series, if you want to call it that. So there's Best American Essays, Best American Travel Writing, Best American Sports Writing, and so forth. Best American Short Stories has been around for 100 years. Literature is respectable, right? It's in the canon. Every university has an English department. Best American Comics is a sort of recent addition to all of this. The first Best American Comics volume was in 2006. So the one that's coming out in 2015 is technically the 10th annual volume. So in many ways, you can almost read that timeline as having something to do with the fact that comics have only recently entered the realm of the institution, only recently started to be taught in universities, only recently been a regular presence in bookstores and libraries, only recently are beginning to be awarded prizes, only recently are comics artists beginning to get grants and the kinds of things that writers and artists in other fields have had access to for a longer period of time. It's not the newest volume. Actually, the newest one is Best American Infographics, which probably maybe says something about the future in a way that the edition of Best American Comics did 10 years ago. Anyway, I'd like to talk just very briefly about how this book functions. How is it that we make a critical statement every year as a book? And I promise I'm not going to talk about this book for the whole talk. But Best American Comics functions in the same way as all of the other Best American series, in that there's a series editor like me who works on the book for multiple volumes, sort of shepherding the process along. And every year there's a more famous and distinguished and well-known guest editor. In this case, it was Scott McCloud, who's the author of a book called Understanding Comics that I'll talk about shortly. Has anyone read Understanding Comics or seen it? Yeah, so a few of you. It's probably the most well-known book about comics. So, anyway, so for 2014, Scott McCloud was the guest editor, as I said. For 2015, it's the novelist Jonathan Lethem. Previous volumes have had Linda Berry, Chris Ware, Charles Burns, if you're familiar with any of those artists. Okay, so my role as series editor, first and foremost, is to, the most basic passive thing that I do is I receive an enormous quantity of submissions that come in through the mail. The nice thing about this project is, and this applies across all the Best American titles, is that it's completely open. It's a very democratic process. Absolutely anyone can submit their work, and I can tell you, as the person who receives it, that there's a lot of stuff by people who I've never heard of, who maybe have only printed 20 copies of their comic that arrives in the mail. I get work from students. I get work from people who, have had long careers in other fields maybe, but have never tried making a comic before and try making it, and then they send it in to me. It's very, very open. So I get this enormous quantity of material in the mail. Additionally, I do, it is my responsibility to make sure that we're, as much as I can, that we're getting the material that we should be looking at in any given year. It's my job to really know my field and to understand, which publishers are publishing material we should look at, which artists are emerging, who we should be keeping an eye on. So I do a lot of outreach to publishers, to individual artists, sometimes on a very, very small press level, many artists who self-publish their own work, and so forth. So I collect all of this material. I go to comics festivals, I make myself available, and I collect material there too. So I end up with, I don't know how many hundreds of pieces, probably more than 1,000. And then I have to read and look at everything. And then from that huge quantity of material, I narrow it down to a pool of about 125 or so pieces that I send to the guest editor. Then the guest editor makes the final choices about what goes into the book. And then beyond that, there's a lot of things that we need to think through. Who do we want to get to draw the cover? Who do we want to get to draw the end papers? We have to write introductions. How do we want to structure the book? There are design choices. And then, of course, there are a lot of really boring, time-consuming things that have to do with securing permissions from artists and publishers so that we can reprint their material in the work. Fortunately, I do work with a lot of professional people at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt who are very experienced in doing some of those things, so I don't have to do that all myself. Anyway, this is the first volume in the series that I worked on, the one that came out last year. The one that's coming out in October that I mentioned is my second. And I think this is a really good volume for anyone who is interested in getting a taste of what the contemporary comics field looks like and what the diversity and variety of material out there is, because Scott McCloud is a comics theorist, someone who writes about comics. He's not a critic exactly. And he's interested in understanding what the map of the landscape is, identifying the major territories. And he did something that we haven't really done in exactly this way in the book before. And I know that this isn't legible. It probably looks like ants on a tablecloth. But this is the table of contents. And what you can maybe see is that there's this red text periodically in the table of contents. He divided the book up into topical sections, identifying major areas of the comics field as he sees them today. And while maintaining the high level of quality that the series is intended to uphold, and while representing his own personal responses as a reader, he also tried to create a map of the territory with this book, to make it a kind of guidebook to contemporary comics. So I'm not going to show you every section, but just to give you a little glimpse of how this book is structured. For example, this is a section called Great Comics Are Not a Genre. In other words, these are kind of the all-stars, the people who are in the book fairly regularly, people like Robert Crumb and the Hernandez brothers, or Charles Burns. So we had a selection from Charles Burns' book, The Hive. This is what the cover of the actual book looks like. We were able to run an excerpt from that book, and if you've never seen this work before, it's extremely carefully drawn work that's synthesizing styles from mid-20th century horror and romance comics, but then reconfiguring those styles and formal approaches to tell more subtle and nuanced stories than those comics from the 40s and 50s are typically well known for. Another section is called Raising Readers, and the intention of this section was actually to spotlight for younger readers, because that's a booming field right now. There have been a number of titles for younger readers that have been fairly successful, like the Bone series published by Scholastic. One of the highlights here is Drama by Raina Telgemeier, who's become, has anyone heard of Raina Telgemeier? A couple of people. She's become like the Judy Blume of comics. I've seen her speak at book events, and I've seen like entire Girl Scout troops show up carrying copies of her comics, and it's a really heartwarming thing. And you know, she draws these really charming, very appealing stories about middle grade life. So this is about a drama club stage crew, and of course the actual drama of who likes who, as these kids are sort of just starting to get to the age of having those kinds of interests and so on. It's really charming, appealing work. Another section in the book is called Family Tree. This focuses on autobiographical stories that all happen to be somehow connected to family relationships too. There are several pieces here. As you can see, I'll show you just pictures from one of them called Letting It Go. This is by Miriam Caton, who was born in Hungary during World War II. She obviously lives in the U.S. now. It's Best American Comics. We don't get to cover European comics, unfortunately. But anyway, Miriam Caton's been living in the U.S. for quite a long time, working in comics, animation, and I think illustration too. And this is, she was born in Hungary during World War II. When she was a little girl, she and her mother managed to escape during the Holocaust. And this is a book that she published that's about, and you can see she works in this kind of beautiful colored pencil style. I regret that the projection doesn't always do justice to the artwork, but the book is about her son moving to Germany, and her going to Germany for the first time, and kind of having this resurgence of emotion connected to her childhood, and having to, as the title suggests, sort of get over her distaste for the very idea of, her son maybe living in Germany and that being a place for life. Testimonials is another section. And these are nonfiction stories like March, Book 1 by Congressman John Lewis and his collaborators. It's about the American Civil Rights Movement. Another piece in that section is a comic that's serialized online called Hip Hop Family Tree by Ed Tiskor. It tells the story of the history of hip hop using the style of Marvel comics from the 1970s and 80s. Another book that we featured is called Building Stories, which is a very avant-garde book, which is why we turned the text sideways. This is a book that looks like a board game. It comes in a box, and this is what the box, you can see what the box cover looks like, but inside are 14 individual booklets in different formats that you can read in any order that all together tell you the story of a woman's life. Because of the strange formatting, we had to print that work sideways. And just the last section I'll show you, and these aren't the only ones, is called the Kuiper Belt. And this is a reference to a meteor, a belt of meteors and asteroids on the outer periphery of the solar system. And this is a section where Scott put what he perceived as some of the more avant-garde work in the book. And you can sort of see how experimental and poetic comics can